Hi everyone, welcome to the NL Seminar Talk. Today, it's my absolute pleasure to introduce Emily Bender. Emily is a Professor of Linguistics at the University of Washington and the Faculty Director of the Professional Masters in Computational Linguistics program. Her research interests include the interaction of linguistics and NLP, computational semantics, multilingual NLP, and the societal impact of language technology. Please welcome her and enjoy the talk. Thank you, Emily.
Thank you so much. I'm really happy to be here, and I hope to one day also visit you all in person. My 18-year-old son is starting at UCLA this fall, so I will have reason to come to LA, even if you consider that other school the evil school. So I'm delighted to talk with you today about ethical risks in language technology, and this talk is basically, it's not I will refer some to my paper on data statements, but this talk does not correspond to anything written yet. It's basically me trying to get my arms around the kinds of risks that we face, and then think about how data statements or other kinds of transparent documentation can help and where they can't. So it's sort of an attempt to get at an overview. My goals here are to present a typology, and I'll define typology in a moment, of the risks of adverse impacts of the kind of technology we work on. This is very much non-exhaustive and preliminary, and I'm really interested in your feedback on where it does and doesn't work. I'll also present, as I said, data statements, which is one positive step we can take to position ourselves to mitigate these risks. Reflect on which of the risks data statements can help with, and then also reflect on whose job it is to worry about these things. So data statements are one tool, they're not a panacea. They can't help with everything, but they can help in some cases. And spoiler alert, it's everyone's job in different ways. And I think I have, depending on how distracted I get by the details of the case studies, about 45 minutes of material here, but I'm very happy to take questions along the way. And Peter suggested that we end at 11:55 sharp to leave time for questions after that as well. But especially since we're not all sitting in the same room, it's really nice to see reactions in the form of questions along the way. So what's a typology? I come to typology from linguistics, where we talk about typologies of linguistic structures. And so I conceive of this as a systematic classification of phenomena along one or more dimensions. So a taxonomy is also a classification of phenomena. And the difference between a typology and a taxonomy is that the dimensions need to have categories that sort of speak to each other in some way or fit together in some way. And a typology should also help us explore the space of possibilities. That is, if we have these dimensions and there's one cell in that matrix that's not filled, we can go look for examples there and say, hey, are we missing something? Because the typology predicts that there might be something of this kind. And also helps us to understand the relationships across categories. There is other work that attempts to categorize the harms that can come when we deploy language technology. So Hovey and Spruitt was a really important paper that sort of brought this into the ACL scene. This was an ACL 2016 paper. It's sometimes described as the first, it's not. And in particular, there was work going on in France in French language publications at least a couple years prior. But that tends to get overlooked in the English language discussions about this. Barocas et al. 2017 looks at ethics and AI more generally and is proposing a classification of the kinds of harms. And so this is just to sort of acknowledge that I'm not the only one thinking about this. I don't yet have a very deep understanding of the Barocas et al. One. My experience of the Hovey and Spruitt is that it felt like, well, here's a list of things, but I had no sense of how they fit together. And so that sort of drove me to say, well, can we make a tighter typology? In thinking about this, I'm drawing on two sets of background scholarship. One is value-sensitive design. And this is a school of technology and socio-technical system design that goes back about 25 years. Friedman is one of the principal authors here. And value-sensitive design, among other things, proposes that we always should look in terms of stakeholders. So stakeholders are people who are affected by the technology or the system being designed. And we should design to support their values. So the three steps are: figure out who the stakeholders are, learn from them what their values are, and then think about how whatever it is you're designing can be designed to support those values. So that's one sort of background that I'm working from. And then the other is sociolinguistics. So sociolinguistics is the part of the field of linguistics that looks at how languages vary and how that variation interacts with social structures at both micro and macro scales. And so some guiding principles that I take from sociolinguistics are as follows. The first is that variation is the natural state of language. We will always find in any language community variation in pronunciation, variation in word choice, variation in grammatical structures. And when you have that kind of variation, it is very common to have one variety, one sort of set of variants anointed as the standard. But that is always just a question of power and not anything inherent to the language variety itself. That is, the people who are in power get to say, our way of speaking is correct, and we are going to make sure that we use it as gatekeeping, and you don't get to be part of the power structure unless you can speak like someone who has had access to the power structure, and so on. Conversely, language varieties and variants or features that are associated with marginalized groups tend to be stigmatized. So people will say, a really common one in English is English does negative polarity items instead of negative concord in its standard varieties. So that means instead of saying, I don't want nothing, you say, I don't want anything, right? But if you contrast that with plenty of other languages, you see negative concord, where once you have sentential negation, you have to have everything else shows up in the negative form too. In English, within our language ideology, we tend to say, oh, well, that's illogical double negation, right? I don't want nothing has to mean I want something, because that would be logical. That's all BS, all right? That's post hoc rationalization of why one variety is better than the other. Couple other points from sociolinguistics. Meaning, so both in terms of the denotations of words, but also how they fit into this larger set of language ideology and social signaling with language, is always negotiated in language use. Every time we speak to each other and we successfully or unsuccessfully communicate using words both about the content and about the social structures that we're communicating in, we are reproducing and subtly changing those meanings. And then finally, our social world is largely constructed through linguistic behavior. Right? When we inhabit the world, we inhabit physical space, but we also inhabit social space, and that social space happens mostly in language. All right, that was a lot. That was sociolinguistics in 3 minutes, but hopefully it'll set the stage a bit here. Here's my attempted typology. So thinking about the value-sensitive design notion of stakeholders, which is broken down to direct and indirect stakeholders, that's my first dimension in the typology. So the direct stakeholders are people who actually interact directly with the technology. And among direct stakeholders of language technology, we can differentiate people who are interacting with that technology of their own volition, so they're doing this by choice, or they didn't have a choice, but they're interacting with it directly anyway. So that's one set of cases. And then we have indirect stakeholders. And these are people who are not the ones interacting with the technology, but nonetheless, their lives are affected by it. And there I don't have this nice tight by choice, not by choice opposition, but rather 3 categories that I'm still working on how to relate to each other. But the subtypes that I have here are the indirect stakeholders might be the subject of a query. They might be a contributor to a broad corpus, or they might be the subject of stereotypes. And I have examples to illuminate all of these. And my goal with doing this is to try to find a structure that is more structured than this. I'm not done yet because those 2 things don't relate to each other the way that I want them to. But nonetheless, it has buckets that I can put all of the case studies that I know about in. Right, so that's sort of the goal here. And I'm also always interested in case studies that don't fit under these headings. Right, so what I'm going to do is peek at the time for a moment. Okay, and I'm going to take you through some examples of these. Yes.
So I feel like there's something missing here, which is the what does it seems like there's an assumed having jumped to the there is a way in which some stakeholders are affected, and I wonder if there's kind of a framing thing about what is the dimension of ethical consequence. So people being marginalized is marginalization in one particular way is one angle, but then also there could be geopolitical ramifications of NLP, or there could be environmental ramifications. And I wonder if there's, so that kind of higher level like dimensions of thing need to be in place first, or is there an assumption that we're working in one specific subworld and then going from there?
So I think it's more like this is an alternate frame on the same sets of harms. So you can also look in terms of types of harms. So the Baraka paper talks about like reputational harms, allocational harms, and a few other things like that. And when I presented similar material at Yale, Claire Bowen was suggesting that among, for her, it was among the indirect stakeholders looking at, are we talking about harms to an individual or harms to a community? So this is definitely not the only way of chopping up the space, and it's never meant to be that. But my goal is to make it so that if you're looking through this lens, there's a bucket for everything. And so I don't have the environmental harms in my examples, but I think that through this lens would be a kind of indirect stakeholder.
Right, so
right?
You can get to what I was getting at from the direction you're coming from.
Yeah, I think so.
Got it.
Okay. So here's my first example. This is actually an example. So this is direct stakeholders by choice. So this is somebody who is directly using a system and they're choosing to use it. So I choose to use this voice assistant or dictation software or MT system, but it doesn't work for my language or my language variety. And then the harm that I could experience is, well, that's telling me that my language is inadequate, right? Also, it can make the product unusable for me. So that's sort of one thing that can go wrong in the scenario. Another thing is the system doesn't indicate to me how reliable it is. But if I'm using it, the only way that I have access to something is through machine translation or through auto captioning, and I don't know when it's uncertain or when it might be wrong, then I'm left in the dark about what I might be missing. And so here, I think a very sharp case is if you imagine somebody who is deaf or hard of hearing and the only access they have to talks at a conference is through the captions, when the captions are hilariously bad, they know that they're likely wrong. But they can be a little bit wrong and look plausible. And especially if you've got a really strong language model that's smoothing things out, it can be really hard to tell when it's wrong. And at risk of dwelling too long on this example, I want to say there's conversely, a very nice example of designing for this that I've seen in the Microsoft Skype translator. So that's speech-to-speech translation. And you get to see it do transcription on the source language side, and then you get to see also the machine translation output. And it's more or less real time. And in both of those, you get to see it revising its hypotheses as it goes. And I think that's a really nice way to flag, this isn't certain, it's not 100%, because you can see the machine changing its mind. So there's design elements like that that can help surface the uncertainty in intuitive ways for users that can be very helpful. All right, sticking with direct stakeholders, but now thinking about cases where it's not by choice. This would be things like I had to do a screening interview for a job and it was conducted by a virtual agent or with a virtual agent listening in, or I'm trying to access my account information at the bank and I have to talk to the virtual agent on the phone first. Or I'm trying to call 911. So this last one does not exist to my knowledge. The first two do, and it's my nightmare that it would. All right, imagine that access to 911 is mitigated by a virtual agent. All right, so in all three cases, what if it doesn't work well for my language variety? Then I could end up scoring poorly on an interview, even though the content of what I said was perfectly fine, but the system couldn't understand me. Or I can't access my account information, or I can't get through to 911. Right, just because it doesn't work with my language variety. And slightly different to language variety, I met at AAAS a trans man from Turkey who is unable to access his bank account back in Turkey because his voice has changed as he has transitioned, and it refuses to recognize him as the same person. So there's other ways in which you can design technology that can just lock people out in really unfortunate ways. Okay, still direct stakeholders not by choice. Let's take a look now at, now we're up to GPT-3, right? We had this language modeling technology that can generate very real sounding text, at least in English, but that text is not grounded in any actual relationship to facts, right? You can spit out stuff that looks like a newspaper article or looks like something that purports to be factual, but it is just made up by the machine. So as a consumer of that, I might end up mistaking the text for statements that are made by some human that's therefore publicly committed to them. Or I might be aware that that's out there and then become very distrustful of everything that I see and unable to find trustworthy information. The sort of sociolinguistic angle here that's important is that if we are training language models on text that is standard or official sounding, then the output is also going to sound standard and official sounding, possibly worsening these kinds of effects. Okay, moving on to indirect stakeholders. This is the subject of a query subtype. So let's say someone searches for me online, but the search triggered display of negative ads, including my name, because of stereotypes about my ethnic identity. And this is exactly the case that Latanya Sweeney documents in her 2013 paper. So this happened to her. She's an African-American professor of computer science. She was sitting in a colleague's office. The colleague wanted to read some of her work, so typed her name into Google, and up in the side ads was, "Has Latanya Sweeney ever been arrested?" She was like, "Excuse me? What? Where did that come from?" And so she investigated this very thoroughly and very carefully and found that there were two different variants of those ads. One was find background information about name, and the other one was, has name ever been arrested? And she very clearly documented that you tended to get the has been arrested version if the name sounded African American, and not if the name sounded like it was, European heritage American. And this is, her methodology was not able to say why this was happening, but the guess was not that it was designed to happen that way, but that the incentives in the system, right? These are online ads, the advertiser gets paid if someone clicks on it. And so the algorithm optimizes for clicks. And so the algorithm learned that these combinations were more likely to generate clicks. So where is the harm here? Imagine if you are someone applying for a job and someone is looking for your publications, and then they get the subliminal message that you are maybe criminal alongside in the ads. Like, these are the kinds of harms that can come up. So that was first example of subject of a query where they were actually directly searching for the individual. Another one is, let's say someone is doing a search for critics of the government and they find my blog post or my tweet, which I thought was, oh, it's just one tweet in a sea of all of Twitter. How could anybody find this? Well, those of us who do NLP know that in fact it's really easy to find specific things through search. What if someone puts my words into a machine translation system and then that MT system gets the translation wrong and I end up arrested? This actually happened in 2017. Facebook translation system translated a caption written in Arabic that said "Good morning." It was captioned on a photo of a man in front of a bulldozer, and it was translated into "attack them." And the Israeli police just took the translation at face value and went and arrested the person who had posted it. Could have been much worse. He was only detained for a day, but there was no flagging to the people using this translation that this might be wrong, and so they took it at face value. Okay, continuing with the indirect stakeholders subject of query. We frequently see papers where people are designing a system to classify other people by identity characteristics according to linguistic features, right? Does this person sound female? Does this person sound gay, right? And if someone deployed one of those, and I'm someone who presents myself differently in different online venues, like I, will say in my bio on one site that I have certain identity characteristics and not display those on another, but the system is looking at my language behavior and making guesses about my identity, I can end up being outed in the venues where I thought I was not performing that identity. Okay, so those were the query type ones. Now looking at indirect stakeholders who are contributors to broad corpus. Let's say ASR doesn't work so well for my language as it does for other people. Then my contributions are going to be rendered invisible to search engines. Now, invisible can be good or bad. Here I'm thinking of the case of someone who's maybe a YouTuber who wants their content to be accessible and found. And if the auto captioning is not working as well in what they're saying, then it's going to be that much less discoverable. Alternatively, let's say there's language ID systems out there and they don't identify my dialect as belonging to English. And then you have something that's, for example, a social media-based disease warning system, and it doesn't work in my community because my tweets and everyone else speaking my variety got filtered out at the beginning. And this is the example that's imagined by Jurgens et al. In 2017 when motivating having more diverse data sets for language ID. Finally, we had the indirect stakeholders as subjects of stereotypes. There's a common trope that virtual assistants are gendered as female and virtual assistants are ordered around. And so this is sort of continually reproducing this you can order around female entities thing in society. Also, systems that are built using general web text, otherwise known as general web garbage, as a proxy for word meaning or as a proxy for world knowledge are picking up not ground truth, but the way people talk about the world. And this is very well documented at this point in all of that work that looks at bias and word vectors. My favorite example of it is a blog post by Robin Spear, where she very carefully steps through the creation of a sentiment analysis system using word vectors trained on general web garbage. And she finds that the resulting sentiment analysis system systematically underpredicts the stars for Mexican restaurants. Like it fails, it does poorly for Mexican restaurants. And digging into it, what she finds is that the word Mexican in general discourse in the US around immigration gets associated with lots of kinds of negative things. And so what the system learns is, you've called this restaurant Mexican, therefore you have already said something negative about it. So it's a nice example, I mean, it's a frustrating example, but it's a very clearly laid out example about how the biases in how we talk about the world can end up having these unintended consequences if we just unthinkingly use word vectors as a proxy for word meaning. There's also the example of Amazon having to scrap their automatic resume screening system because it had basically learned to associate typically masculine hobbies with the kind of people who get hired. And so they ended up reproducing and worsening their gender skew in their hiring practices. And then finally, famously, image search reflects stereotypes, and that can be harmful. And in here, I think a really important book is Sophia Noble's Algorithms of Oppression. And this one, like Google is sort of constantly trying to fix this as the ones get pointed out. So when I created this particular slide in early 2019, this is what searching for doctor turned up, which is not even representative of doctors in the US. Right? It's far worse than reality. So that sometimes initially the defense out of Google was, well, we're just showing you what's true in the world. And that was never actually true, right? Because Google image search is based on what pictures people choose to take and how they choose to caption them. And sort of unmodified search will be reflective of that set of facts, which is not the same as a set of facts in the world. But Google keeps getting in trouble for these things, and so they keep tweaking their algorithm. So it's you know, they recognize that just reflecting that back is not the right way to go. Okay, so having gone through the examples that I know about, now I want to spend some time reflecting on what we can do about this. And I think the very first thing is to make sure that we broaden the lens when we look at machine learning in NLP and you know, more broadly, but NLP is the part that I know about and care about. So this is a definition of machine learning tasks taken from a textbook, Mitchell 2017, where he says, look, if you have the task definition and you've picked your learning approach and you've got your trained test data and your evaluation metric, then the problem is well defined. And what I want us to do is to zoom out. We've still got those 4 things, but then we have to ask, how does the data set model the task? We've got some particular data set. We've got this notional task that we're trying to do. What's the connection there? What's the alignment? How does the task relate to the world? Right? Well, there's this thing that we want to do. If we actually used it in context, what would happen? Why do we care about this task, right? Are we building something useful, or are we learning about computers or people or the modeling domain? And that can have implications for how we answer these questions about how the task relates to the world. How do we collect the data? So there's some potential bias there. And then what happens when we deploy this? When we put it out in the world and it performs as expected, who benefits, who's harmed? And if it's failing, like what are the failure modes and who's harmed and possibly who benefits? So one piece of this, one piece of sort of broadening that lens is better documentation of data sets. And Friedman and I proposed data statements for NLP. This was part of like the sort of moment of convergent discovery. So while we were talking about that, Timnit Gebru et al. Were talking about data sheets for data sets, and Meg Mitchell et al. Were talking about model cards for model reporting. And through all of these, there's this notion that if we provide good documentation of the data sets, then we can deploy systems more carefully and more safely. So in the case of language in particular, that's what we're focused on with the data statements, we want to make it clear which populations and linguistic styles are represented and which ones are not represented, to support reasoning about the possible effects of mismatches, and then also to recognize limitations of training data and test data. So the training data has effects on how systems can be appropriately deployed. Right? Think back to the 911 system. The training data had better match the people in the community before you even think about doing that. And even still, I'm not sure you want to do it, right? Test data has effects on what we can measure and claim about system performance. So, you know, if somebody ever says, you know, I've solved task X, no, they haven't, right? They have gotten certain impressive performance on a particular data set that represent tasks as in a certain language for certain speakers, and so on and so on and so on. So that's the more carefully described version of that result. And if we have good information about the test data, we can do that careful description. So very quickly, for data statements currently, these are the general topics that we want to see covered. What's the data that you picked? Why did you pick that data? Whose language is it? What kind of language behavior are we talking about? And so on. And I can answer in more detail about this, but just want to let you know this exists. And we have examples that you can look at if you're building a data set and you want to create a data statement for it. That long form obviously isn't going to fit within the page limit of an ACL paper. So we say you also need to have a short form, which is 60 to 100 words that sort of hits the main points and points to the long form, so that whenever you are reporting experiments on something, you have that context there. So on to the question of whose job is this? I have thought of 5 different roles that people embody with respect to language technology, and most people have, you know, at least 2 of these. So we all fall into the first category. We are researchers or developers in speech and language technology. And this kind of documentation can help us build better systems, can help us promote our systems appropriately, and also help us educate the public about how well to expect the systems to work. A second role is procurers. So these are people who might be buying language technology to use either for government purposes or for industry purposes. And procurers, therefore, should choose systems or training data that match the use case and align the task assigned to the speech language technology system with their goals, and clear documentation will help in those tasks. Consumers are people who are directly using the technology, either paying for it or not, right? It is really important for us to understand as consumers this output of the system as the result of pattern recognition that's trained on some data set somewhere. And so if we can make the presence and characteristics of those data sets salient to the people using the systems, they're better positioned to understand that. Members of the public have a role in learning about the benefits and impacts of this technology and advocating for appropriate policy. And then policymakers should be considering the impacts of pattern matching on progress towards goals that they might hold around equity. And should, I think, consider requiring disclosures of characteristics of training data in a system that's going to be used by the public or on the public. Here's an example of that. If we think about direct stakeholders whose varieties aren't well represented, and we think about it from the point of view of being in R&D, if we have a better sense of which language varieties are underrepresented, we can then direct our effort appropriately. We don't need everybody creating more and more data sets for mainstream American English, maybe, right? Maybe we can look a bit more broadly and say what languages and language varieties could actually use some attention. And we can also test our approaches more broadly, right? So what's the, I've claimed that this works for English. Well, which English, right? Is it going to work for Singaporean English? Well, if I had that data set, if I could go find that data set, I could test it. Someone who's procuring a system could look at a data statement and say, okay, is this trained model likely to work for our clientele or our users? consumers. Is this likely to work for me? Members of the public can advocate for models that are trained on data sets that are responsive to the community of users, and policymakers might consider requiring automated systems to be accessible to speakers of all language varieties in the community. So policymakers are going to have a certain community of people that they are responsible for. I think, so you can sort of make the same point around indirect stakeholders. So procurers who are thinking about developing something, are deploying, for example, search over ASR captions, might ask, what information is this going to expose and what's it going to miss? Consumers can say, is this software being transparent about how well it can work and under what circumstances it works better or worse? And again, there's advocacy and policy making roles. But I want to point out that while data statements are helpful, they're not a panacea. Mitigation of negative impacts of speech and language technology actually requires ongoing work and engagement and thinking through, what are the costs, what are the harms, what are the benefits, who are they accruing to? And the point about data statements is that they position us to do that work, not that once you've done the data statement, you're done. And then in particular, there's things that I don't see how data statements are going to help with. So the impacts of gendering virtual agents, for example, is kind of independent of these aspects. Similarly, privacy concerns around classification of identity characteristics. You could have all the transparency in the world about the data set. That's not going to solve the privacy concern. And just more generally, there's some cases where the answer to this technology is biased isn't, okay, let's get more data and make sure it works for everybody. It might be, let's just not. And this is where face recognition is going, right? It doesn't work as well for people with darker skin. It is also tends to be deployed in policing and surveillance. And those two things interact because policing and surveillance is most often done too in this country, people with darker skin. And in a sense, it's worse, I guess, if it's being done and it's inaccurate because you're likely to be picked up for false reasons, but we don't even need all of that surveillance in the first place. So the answer isn't make it better, the answer is don't. And this is what people like Joy Bomlini, I can't say her name well yet, and I can't picture it well enough, so I'm not gonna try again, but also Deb Raji and Timnit Gebru are advocating for. It's just like, just don't. One thing that data statements I think do help with is problems stemming from automation bias. And automation bias is this cognitive bias that says, well, the computer said so, the computer's doing math, that must be objective, right? We don't want people looking at computer output saying, well, this must be true because the computer said it. And if we can make it clearer to the people who are the direct stakeholders that the computer is doing pattern matching and it's doing pattern matching based on this, that, and the other data set, then they might be less likely to fall for that automation bias. So to summarize, there's this wonderful line from Tyler Schnobelen, the L in NLP means language and language means people. And so therefore, even though we might like to think of ourselves as just working on fun puzzles and math, we're actually working on things that concern people. And so we have some responsibilities here. And I want to add to that language necessarily also means variation. And so looking to the lessons of sociolinguistics is really important. When we are working on technology that will be deployed in the world, we need to keep an eye on how it fits into that world. And taking on that responsibility, it's very easy to quickly get bogged down in, this is too terrible, this is too hard, I can't possibly avoid hurting people, and I can't stand that, so I'm just gonna turn away, either from the field as a whole or from the societal impacts. But the message that I'm trying to bring here is we don't have to get stuck there, and that transparency is a good starting point. And documentation of data sets and models and clear discussion of the application world relationship starts to empower us to actually make things better instead of just sit with how awful it all is. So that's my summary. If people are curious, I have a couple of slides about the Germaval shared task, but I think I want to stop now for questions. And how do you usually do questions? Do people type in the chat? Just raise their hand, just jump in? What's the...
So I have not received anything in the chat as far as I can see. So if anyone has a question, oh, John, is John's hand raised?
Well, I have my hand up nominally because I can ask a question, but I'd rather let somebody else ask a question first. So I just wanted to advocate maybe putting up your hands if you think you might have a question to ask, and then we can maybe sort.
That's a good idea. Let me.
I don't know if that, we don't have a perfect.
If anybody has a question now, they can ask. I have a question. First of all, thank you for the great talk. I'm going to go ahead, but people please join in. So I totally understand, resonate with the idea that we need to document, we need to work more on the documentation that the data that we work with, and not just say report results, say it worked, this is my test scores, yay. What do you think, well, besides data documentation and data, like this is the data that I work with, what do you think needs to be done on the data collection part? So the things that, like, a lot of data is now collected during mechanical turks. So does that need to be more like regulated to, or like evaluated to? What needs to be done on that part?
Yeah. So yes, absolutely. When we're doing data collection, we need to work on both quality control and also the ethics of the collection process. And this goes to John's point earlier about, are we, what about things like environmental impact? I think another one is working conditions. So when something is done via crowdsourcing, I think we need to, as a field, move to a norm of what's what I'm looking for, transparency around how people were compensated, right? So how much was paid, how much work do people do, sort of those conditions should be also part of the documentation of the data. And this is one of those cases where the two things we're interested in are not, two of the things we're interested in are not in tension, right? So you get, I think, better data if you're working with workers who are treated fairly. There's a problem at the other end. Like if you make something too lucrative, then you can attract people who are not going to take it seriously. And so you can't just like buy your way into good data. There's a lot of design stuff that has to be done. But I think that transparency there is also important. And one of the things that we learned from a workshop that we did that was at LREC, it was online during the LREC week, on data statements, was we were thinking about this as sort of post hoc documentation. So somebody who picks up the data set knows what's in it. And you might be thinking about your data statement while you're creating the data set because you want to make sure you have the information to put in the data statement at the end. But one of the things that came out from our participants was, if you think through these things, both in terms of whose language and am I building something representative, but also, study design, what am I going to have to tell people about how I did this crowdsourcing at the end? At the beginning, you end up doing better data collection. And so that you end up with a better data set. And I'm starting to talk with Leon Derchinsky actually about precisely that, about creating sort of a best practices for crowdsourced data documentation, where our method is going to be looking at data statements and saying, okay, what would we want to be able to say given a crowdsourced data set, and how do we plan for that at the beginning of a project?
Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
So we have another hand raised. It's from Nina. Nina, you can unmute and ask your question.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for the talk. I have a question. You mentioned that there are cases that we shouldn't even think about making these systems better, like the facial recognition systems, and we should get rid of them. Like this is an idea that many people have, and they're saying actually all these problems happen because we are trying to use these AI systems in social context. But isn't that the goal, to have an impact in the community, not just work on the theory and stuff, but like actually deploy some systems that are actually being used by the society? And it's our job to make sure it's not happening and improve those systems, as opposed to say, oh, discard them. Absolutely. I just want to know your take on that.
So I think absolutely we should be thinking in terms of building things that are deployed in society. And it's not the case that everything we build is just hopelessly bad and don't do it. Just the point of that example is that there are some things where the primary use case in society is one that is harmful. And it seems like face recognition, and by face recognition, I mean identifying a particular individual given an image of their face. The way that it is getting deployed is just part of harmful systems. And so when we look at that and we see the outcomes, the pivot is to advocate for policy that says, no, this is not okay, it shouldn't be used that way. But there are plenty of other applications of technology that are being used in beneficial ways. And so there, our responsibility is to engage with the stakeholders and to sort of make sure that it's not just, yes, we are going to appeal to the existence of blind people and the need for screen readers to motivate text to speech, but rather actually talk, if that's our motivating use case, then engage and find out, okay, what is needed in a screen reader? What are the improvements that are really missing? You know, and now I'm making stuff up because I've not done this conversation. This is just an example, but it could be that blind people are really stymied by, and because this is a discussion I've seen on Twitter, all of those ASCII art memes apparently are just obnoxious for screen readers. And so the move on Twitter say, you know, don't do that. Don't do the thing where it's a picture of a house, or if you have to do it, take a screenshot of it, post the screenshot with an alt text that just has what you've put in the house, right? But you can imagine if that really is as big of a problem as it appears to be on Twitter, using that to motivate developing screen reader technology that can recognize that and just describe the image and read the text, for example. So that went a little bit off trails, but the point is that, yes, we need to think about society. Sometimes the answer is, no, don't build it. And sometimes, and not only don't build it, but like advocate for policy that would prevent its use in that way. And sometimes the answer is, yes, build it, but build it in this direction. This is what the actual societal need is, as opposed to what makes for a fun test set for your paper. Does that answer your question, Nina?
Yeah, thank you. But like in general, I'm like kind of I respect Deborah and all her opinions, but in this case, I'm kind of not like, because if that's the case, then most of the applications are shown to be biased and harming the society. In that case, we should shut down all the systems. And there was a time in the AI community that the government was saying, oh, this research is not beneficial because it's actually harming the society and stuff. And in my opinion, it's better to like try to make the systems better as opposed to advocating in this or going in a position of the industry to say, oh, stop these systems in the first place. And I think that's happening in a large scale now. But I appreciate the response. I agree, definitely. Thank you.
Thank you. All right, Manuel has typed in a question. So thinking about the typology at the beginning of the presentation, an incipient step for participatory design, which has been around for a few decades. Yeah, I think value-sensitive design is related to participatory design. So allow stakeholders to participate in the design of algorithms and, more importantly, data sets and evaluation. Let's see. So yes, I think some form of participatory design is a very good idea. It is interesting to think about how to make time for that and what the collaborations are needed for that. And I think in general, a lot of stuff doesn't get done in machine learning and fields that are being impacted by machine learning because machine learning is on this like super fast publication cycle, which doesn't leave time and space to do these things. And so I would love to see you know, stuff that says, here's how you do participatory design in machine learning, and this is the timeline that we need for it. And the outcome of this is systems that not only are technically interesting and approach interesting problems, but also are connected to actual needs of actual people in the world. And therefore, let's set up reviewing systems and sort of publication incentives that make room for that and value it, rather than saying, oh, well, now you've spent, you know, 4 of your 8 pages talking about this social stuff. I just want the technical details. Like there's a cultural thing we have to work with there. You're welcome. So John, I see your hand is still up.
Sure. But I'll defer to Aparna. I'm not just being humble here. Emily and I have a one-on-one, so really anybody else should ask a question before I do. I'm just here as a placeholder. So please, Aparna, go ahead.
Thank you. I think kind of building on the discussion around Nina's question before, I think one of the things that I always wonder about is even I think within, and I, you know, I loved your presentation, but I think even with better documentation and even with better forethought, at the end of the day, there will be many harms and challenges that we only catch once a system is deployed. And I think the challenge to me with that is just because of, you know, all of the reasons that I think you described, the people who are often going to be harmed by this are people who are underrepresented or have been historically marginalized to begin with. And I guess to me, that kind of sounds like an inequitable distribution of benefits and harms of this research and of this technology, which is, I mean, kind of the IRB definition of not ethical, right? So I mean, I wonder, is there a way that we can, in addition to putting documentation into place, are there other fail-safes or kind of other like harm reduction-esque techniques that we can use to ensure that, you know, that we're kind of capping how bad the harms can get, or kind of capping how inequitable that distribution of benefits and harms can get. Does that make sense?
It does. I think that's a good statement of some of the goals here. And I think it comes back to Manuel's point about participatory design. So if in the design process, you have checkpoints early on where you connect with people who might be impacted by the system and involve them in various ways. And so one proposal for this that comes out of value-sensitive design is called diverse voices. And that was actually developed in the context of developing tech policy. So you have a proposed tech policy, and then the question is, how is this going to work in the world? Well, in addition to everything else we're doing to think that through, let's also create panels of, and the wonderful phrase they use is experiential experts. And so sort of thinking about what the policy addresses and what systems of marginalization and oppression it might interact with, and then go find the people who are representative of those most likely to bear the brunt of that and say, here's a proposed policy, what are your concerns? What do you see? And sort of elicit that input at a stage where the policy is partially formed, so there's something to react to, but it is not decided upon yet. And so it can be further modified. And I think that we could possibly do something similar in the design of language technology. So that's sort of one thing, is to say, we're going to make time at various points in the process to go out into the community and talk with stakeholders. And then another point is that any business will do a better job of catching possible negative impacts if the business itself has more diverse employees, right? That the lived experience is there. Then, like, I mean, the whole thing with the infrared sensors that you'll sometimes see in public restrooms for getting the water to start, getting the soap to start, and getting the blow dry hand things to go. Guess what? Don't work as well on darker skin. And if the people developing that tech all tried it out and they all had pale skin and it worked for all of them, then they may not have thought, oh, there's actually a dimension that we're missing in what we're testing here. Where if the room was diverse to start with, then you could avoid that, I think. So there's a strong connection between building more, I don't like the term ethical so much, although it's really hard to stay away from it. Building technology that is less likely to have adverse impacts in society, or at least it is more equitable and like avoids the extremes, and the push to make sure that the field as a whole is as diverse as it can be. These are not disconnected concerns. The next non-John hand that I see is Ulf.
Yes, thank you very much for a very interesting presentation. There was one part where I cringed a little bit when you suggested that we might think of UCLA as negatively or even as evil. I assume this was tongue-in-cheek, but I can personally say that I've worked at ISI for over 20 years and never heard a negative or derogative statement about UCLA. I value my UCLA colleagues and personal friends. So it's maybe a little bit of a perception of visitors that there's some tension there, but I refer to UCLA as our best buddies. So there you go.
Glad to hear that. I figured it was just a local rivalry thing.
Well, on game days maybe, but
yeah, most of us don't watch football, so we're not into rivalry. We are into technology and computers.
Right. Well, I don't think there's going to be football games for a little while. At least I hope not, under the circumstances. Emilio.
Hi, thank you for the talk. I apologize in advance. I missed the first half, so if I'm gonna ask something that was already covered, apologies. I'll catch up later. But I wanted to get back to this idea of participatory design, and I'm gonna almost play devil's advocate, but I want to make the disclaimer that in fact I kind of not necessarily believe in the question that I'm going to ask, but I know a lot of people who have problems with that, especially, you know, the funding agencies and oftentimes the end users of technologies that we build. And a lot of the work that I do is on fairness, etc. So obviously I'm playing devil's advocate. The question that I have is, when it comes to participatory design, of course, the idea is to, as a partner put it very nicely put together earlier, you know, to make sure that there is a reasonable trade-off between, you know, the benefits and the harms to the populations that could be affected negatively by the technology, right? But there is also a risk, obviously, that the end user of these technologies that are investing in the technologies themselves might not necessarily be okay with the compromises that you make when you mitigate the risks of these technologies, right? So there was the surveillance example that was brought up a couple of times by Nina and others. We should definitely get rid of it. But, you know, if you were the DoD and you put tens of millions or hundreds of millions of dollars into, you know, funding the over decades, the development of these techniques, you probably don't find this valuable as a proposition, right? I want the technology because I'm going to use it for good, right? I'm going to catch the bad guys, which is probably what happens in some cases, but definitely not what happens in many other cases, right? So I guess the question is, how do you come up with a value proposition for those who invest money in the developments of technologies that are possibly controversial, that can generate negative effects for significant fraction of society and so on? How do you justify that? And I believe that, you know, many people hinted that there is a need to audit these systems. There is a need, so it goes beyond the documentations, but also from, if you take the other side, if you take the position of justifying it to those who support them, how do you make a value proposition? What would you say that would convince them? And then, you know, if time allows later, I'll give you an anecdote that I thought was particularly intriguing that happened to me yesterday. I was on a call with a former DARPA program manager, with a senator, and with a congressman, and they're trying to regulate the spread of fake news in the space of vaccine misinformation, COVID, and so on. I can mention it later. It doesn't matter, but yeah.
Seems like an intriguing case study. So let's take the easy case first, where the client is actually a private business rather than a part of the government that is involved with policing or military activity. So if you're talking about a private business, I think the value proposition is the protection of the company's reputation, right? It is important for companies, especially companies that basically have as their business model people giving for free information, eyeballs, attention, so that they can sell things to advertisers. And so the reputation of the company is really important there. And so if you can say, this is going to make you less likely to be embarrassed because we are checking for things that people are going to find and it's going to be the scandal du jour, then that's I think a value proposition. If the funding agency is DARPA or IARPA or similar, there, I think it just comes down to individual decisions of, you know, is this something that I as an individual feel that I should be putting my effort into? And I know that if you are working in a situation where you are responsible to basically fund your own job by getting soft money, then you have, it's harder to be choosy about that. But I think that sometimes the answer isn't, I'm going to try to get DARPA to spend their money on my building a fairer version of this, but rather I'm just personally going to decide not to do that one and try for a different opportunity. I think it can come down to that. But I'm curious about your COVID example, because that sounds like a clear case of machine learning aiming for social good.
Right. I don't see any other hands, so maybe I take a second. But the bottom line is, oftentimes when you develop the technology, you are asked for feedback when it comes to transitioning that into some sort of like operating scenario. But if you're lucky, you are also brought into the discussion when it comes to regulations and policy making, laws, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So in this particular case, because of work that I've been doing, including for DARPA, YARPA, and so on, and because of programs that I've been working with DARPA, for example, I brought in into this discussion now for in a number of occasions in the past couple of years. It was regulating bots and automation and how that's used in social media for manipulation, et cetera. And now they're thinking about health-related misinformation. And the idiosyncrasy here, the huge discrepancy between what we do and what, let's say, policymakers and lawmakers want to attain, is that we operate on completely different levels of complexity. And this is fairly obvious for everyone who is a little bit more senior like you and I. If you had a chance to talk to a lawmaker, they want a number. Okay, so the discussion between the politicians and the technical people was, you can't nail it into one number, and you can't come up with a single measure to determine what a piece of information is in the space of, let's say, false to truth, accurate to inaccurate, misleading to correct, and so on. And you can't nail it into one number, whether this piece of information is viral or is becoming viral or not, and whether you should stop it in some shape or form. But these people write laws, and sometimes it's really hard to codify the complexities that emerge in our work into something that then you can distill, you can regulate, you can legally pursue, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right? So I found, and this has happened over time, over the last couple of years, I found this disconnect between, quote unquote, how easy it is to, on paper at least, mitigate some of the technological problems when it comes to fairness, biases, etc., and how hard it becomes then to transfer those things into laws, regulations that can be enacted. I thought it was fascinating, and it comes again. It speaks to the part that you were discussing earlier about participatory design, where you would want to have lawmakers, you might want to have policymakers and so on in the discussion when it comes to designing systems, better systems, mitigation systems, et cetera, but then it's all a completely different problem, how you implement those things in the non-technical world,
So there's a wonderful group that I now get to belong to at the University of Washington called the Tech Policy Lab. And this is specifically a collaboration between people in the law school and people in sort of technology related fields outside the law school. Because the reasoning required to take, so from a technology point of view, we know how the systems work, and we are well positioned to be part of a team, at least understanding the kinds of harms they can do in the world. Oftentimes we need some additional collaborators who are connected to the whatever societal systems we're impacting and know how to study those. And then of course the people who are likely to be impacted themselves. But in order to translate that into policy, there's a whole area of expertise, which is how do you write policy so that it has the effects that you want it to have. And so having interdisciplinary conversations where people talk to each other and then can basically surface proposals that are informed by both of those perspectives is really, really important.
Thank you.
You're welcome. So
I don't think I see any other questions in the chat or any other hands raised. We were planning to finish by 12:10, so Emily can get a break and get some snack before one-on-ones. So I think if everybody is good, we're good.
all right, thank you all very much.
Thanks.
Thank you so much,
See
Emily.
you soon.
Bye.